Today is World Refugee Day, drawing attention to the world's 65.3 million refugees and internally displaced persons, the highest since the Second World War. Joining me now in the studio is Dr Ruvi Ziegler, a visiting professor of international refugee law at the Hebrew University. Dr Ziegler, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
The numbers of refugees and migrants heading towards Europe now is simply staggering. What are Europe's options for coping?
Well, so it is staggering, but it's not unprecedented. So Europe has had another refugee crisis in the Balkans in the 1990s. And one of the differences between that crisis and the current crisis is the way in which European countries currently fail to cooperate. There is a mechanism under the European directives which would allow, in principle, for a burden sharing approach within Europe. That would then mean that about 1 million people who are currently in Germany, if they were spread across 500 million wide European population, would actually be better integrated and would be taken care of. The problem is that there isn't at the moment the political willingness in some of the major European players.
And in terms of the refugees who haven't yet entered the territory of the European Union?
Well, so what Europe has, or the European Union has tried to do with Turkey, is to reach an agreement where the European Union funds camps in Turkey, supports the Turkish government's operation, and in return, as you were, this avails itself from having to take care of refugees in European territory. The problem with that, of course, is that Turkey, even though it's a signatory to the Refugee Convention from 1951, which we're celebrating today the 65th anniversary for, has not applied it to people coming from outside Europe. It's kept a geographical restriction, and so they don't get refugee status and they don't get the rights that are meant to come with refugee status.
Okay, well, staying outside of Europe, there are tens of thousands of African migrants still in Israel, to whom Israel is neither giving permanent asylum, and we're not forcibly deporting them either.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, so Israel signed the Refugee Convention in 1951, ratified in 54, never incorporated into Israeli law, and Israel doesn't have an asylum law. And the implication of that is that for the 42,417 African asylum seekers in Israel, there is no status that protects their rights and freedoms in Israel. It is true, Israel doesn't deport them back to Sudan and Eritrea, where 92% of them come, but neither does it give them either refugee status or, what happens often in Europe in those situations, a status akin to either temporary or subsidiary protection, which would then guarantee social rights, not permanent residence, but a degree to which they can sustain themselves, they can have their livelihood protected.
So why are they being kept in this limbo?
Well, I mean, I think the fundamental problem, and it is a really good opportunity to flag it, is that Israel just lacks a general immigration policy. What Israel has, of course, is a policy in relation to Jews who are entitled to come to Israel through Chok HaShvut. But what it doesn't have is a policy on immigration, on family reunification, on migrant workers, on asylum seekers, and on refugees, which would then take all of these categories the same way other developed countries that faced what we call in the genre mixed migration flows. So the flows where you have both refugees and other people who may not be entitled to status can be attained and assessed for.
Well, on the question of Israeli immigration law, most Israelis are either ex-Jewish refugees themselves or descendants of Jewish refugees. Has this country not done its fair share in terms of alleviating the international refugee burden?
Right. So the point about Jews, of course, in Israel is that Jews are entitled by law to become automatically Israeli citizens. And so the concept of the Refugee Convention is actually a status that is granted to somebody who is not considered to be part of your political community. It's a temporary, potentially long-term, but temporary refuge for somebody from another country who is in need. Israel, of course, for various understandable and justifiable historical reasons, sees every Jew everywhere in the world as entitled to become part of the political community of this country. And so this cannot be seen in the same light as looking at the Refugee Convention. This is a separate policy. It's an immigration policy which has its very specific historical contingencies.
Well, briefly before we wrap up, nearly 70 years on from Israel's War of Independence, the Palestinians still have their own dedicated refugee agency. Why is the international community treated
Yeah.
them differently and separately for so long.
Well, so the history of this is of course very, very odd, which is that the UNRWA status or the UNRWA statute preceded the Refugee Convention. It is from 1949, and when the Refugee Convention was signed, there was a specific exception, Article 1D to the convention, that was intended not to include Palestinians who were originally from the territories that has become Israel as entitled to refugee status, with some exceptions that we don't really have time to get into. But this is where we are, that there really is a two-tier regime in refugee law.